John Solomon, former assistant Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press, national correspondent for the Washington Post. He ran the Washington Times, and most recently, he was, in fact, with the Center for Public Integrity and iWatchNews.com, and very shortly will become the editor of news for Newsweek magazine and the Daily Beast. And he is on the other end of our line this morning. Very accomplished journalist. Thank you for the time this morning.
Oh, great to join you.
I came across this article in a Newsweek magazine. In fact, it's called "A Wimp He Wasn't," and it's about President George Herbert Walker Bush. And it was Newsweek originally, wasn't it, who had President Bush on the cover, and he said, "Fighting the wimp factor," when he was running for president. Where did the idea come about that a former Navy aviator who was shot down over Chichijima there in Japan and survived and made his way up through the ranks was a wimp in the first place?
Well, I think that's it. I mean, that's one of the most famous political covers of the last quarter century, I think, in politics. And it's a label that stuck through Bush all through his tenure as president. And you know, when you look at his resume, it's anything but a wimp's resume, let me tell you that. And the whole idea for this follow-up story came a couple of months ago when it was obvious that about 5 times over 3 months, Democrats were honoring President Bush for heroic things he had done, whether it was his war service, his service to volunteerism. President Obama was talking glowingly of him. And when I heard that Bill Clinton, the man that had vanquished him, was about to have an award ceremony, nationally televised award ceremony, we went back to try to find out why were Democrats who tried to run George H.W. Bush out of office 2 decades ago suddenly embracing him. And in the course of that reporting, came across this stunning and still classified anecdote of him going to El Salvador as vice president. No one in the world knows this. He takes a black helicopter with just 5 people and meets with the warlords of El Salvador and tells them they better stop these inhumane killings of civilians, or the U.S. government's going to pull their aid. And this is a story that, all the things we knew about Latin American policy, Iran-Contra, no one had ever heard this. A vice president sneaking away, meeting in the jungles with armed rebels. And we told that story, and Tina Brown, the Newsweek editor, decided to put a great headline on there saying, "A wimp he was not." And this story continues to resonate. I'm very grateful for all the people who've read it, and I think it put President Bush 41 in the proper light of his resume.
He was a very dutiful vice president, and he was very respectful of President Reagan. Is that why they thought maybe that he was a wimp?
I think there's a lot of factors here, and one of the things is whenever you're the vice president to a magnanimous personality and a political force of Ronald Reagan, you're always going to be second fiddle, and you're always going to be compared to that incredible leader. And so that always hurts someone who's in the shadow. Just ask Al Gore what it was like to be in the shadows of Bill Clinton. I think there's another factor. I think there's a certain decency that comes out of that World War II generation that we're almost lost now. There's so few of them left. But there's a decency and a civility that we don't see in politics today. And in the era in which President Bush ran for president, it was the beginning of this sort of more strident, hardened us and them, Fox versus MSNBC, sort of really partisan world. And he was not that sort of partisan guy. He was a get-it-done sort of guy. And so he had a more respectful civility. And I think that's what, at the time, led to some of these attacks that he was a wimp. What's interesting, it's that trait today, that reason that people are beginning to embrace George H.W. Bush, which is, listen, we're so sick of the meanness and the screaming and the yelling and the screeching and preaching. Isn't it great to embrace someone who, in a different era of politics, had a respect that rose above that? And maybe we need more of that today. And if you look at Bill Clinton's comments in the story and also in the ceremony where he gave this great award to President Bush a couple of weeks ago, he made that point. George Bush was a civil man, and politics needs more civility.
If it were the modern age, would he be called a rhino, Republican in name only? He was awfully moderate, wasn't he?
Well, it depends how you look at things. I mean, on foreign policy, it would be hard to argue that he was moderate. I mean, he was very aggressive in pushing it back against the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. I think the big pockmark on his record for conservatives is that he reneged on his promise not to raise taxes, but he did so, and I think true to the spirit of who he is. He wanted to get something done, and he made a pragmatic deal with Democrats to do that. But I do think that one thing makes Democrats particularly distrustful. But I think his record as a president was one of fairly conservative record on issues of abortion and other things like that. He was fairly in the rights camp, and I think people are looking back at his record now with a more revisionist approach, and maybe saying maybe we kind of miscalculated him a little bit. Maybe he in today's world he wouldn't be as conservative as the conservatives, at the lead of the party. But at the time of his leadership, he was in the mainstream of Republican thinking. Even though there was always the whispers, was he a closet moderate? But I think his record overall, with the exception of the tax one, probably puts him in a fairly conservative category still.
It was read my lips, no new taxes. It was the
Right.
1,000 points of light. And then maybe the most stinging indictment was the Texas governor saying that poor George, he was born with a silver foot in his mouth. I mean, that was a pretty
exactly.
good line.
Playing off the silver spoon. Yeah. Now, listen, there were lots of attacks at the time, but I think when people take the entirety of his record, he's left a record of a general conservative. And on his watch, the wall fell, and while it was Reagan's policies that set that in motion, Bush carried them out to the end. And there's a great anecdote in that Newsweek article where Gorbachev, and here's an example of where the wimp factor came up at the time, and you didn't know the real story. So when the wall fell, conservatives were just furious at Bush for not dancing more excitedly about such an amazing moment, the Reagan policy finally conquering the Cold War and the Soviet Union and communism. And Bush never spoke publicly, but we got hold of some classified documents and talked to some people, and it turns out the real reason he was silent was that Gorbachev had called him privately and made this unbelievable appeal saying, listen, if you get too far out there, if you celebrate too much, I'm going to have a problem keeping the Soviet troops from firing on civilians, and we're going to have another Tiananmen Square massacre. So I plead with you, Mr. President, don't do that. And there's these two handwritten letters that go back between the world leaders. Bush could have pulled that out at the time and said, listen, the reason I'm not dancing is because Gorbachev thinks there could be millions of massacres if the Soviet forces get unleashed. He kept quiet, took the criticism on his chin, and it's only 30 years later, 25 years later, that we find out the real reason why he decided not to dance more excitedly on the fall of the wall. And I think that's a unique part about his personality.
He was a CIA guy, so he knew how to keep a secret, too. John Solomon, it was my great pleasure to speak to you. Congratulations on your success, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks again. Have a good happy holiday.